Hi, this is Paul, and most of you know the guy I'm talking to. And Martin, you're back home.
I am Paul. I am. I think I last saw you. We were in Galway together,
Yep.
and then we had a moment in London. But actually, to be honest, what I remember more than the event in Galway or London is just us chatting on innumerable buses and planes and things like that. And I loved it, and
Yeah.
I miss our conversations. So I'm really glad to be with you today.
Me too. Me too. And that's exactly my recollection as well in the back of Marcus's little car on the way there.
I mean, we couldn't exaggerate enough, could we, for the viewer to understand, you're a tall and mighty man, and your complete humility and lack of complaint as you just sort of contorted your body like some sort of martial artist into the back of that tiny car. It was impressive. And it was across country. It was all the way from Dublin. But I remember I was sort of mithering in the back, and you referred to travels of yours, I think probably in deepest Africa, and I had to stop complaining, you
Go
know.
ahead. Just the Dominican Republic, but it
Oh yeah,
was Marcus's wife was more accustomed to those kinds of
she was.
accommodations in Africa.
Yes.
So.
Yeah.
Um,
Wonderful people.
But then we had a lovely bus ride the other way, and
We did.
that was that was something I'll never forget. And so no, that was a highlight for my trip.
Good.
I've been perusing the House of Beasts and Vines.
Yep.
Tell me about the title, and tell me about, because I have the sense that you're doing. I see a lot of people. I mean, Substack is sort of blowing up right now, and people are doing different things with it. But you're doing something a little different with Substack. So tell me about what you're doing.
Well, House of Beasts and Vines, for a begin, was a title that, do you know, years ago, it comes from an idea I had to have a restaurant that had great wine in it and good meat, the House of Beasts and Vines. And then it just sort of hung around, and I just knew it was too good to let go of. And so I had an idea. I can't recall now why I named it that, but that's what I named it. And it was almost exactly around the same time that I was being publicly outed by Rod Dreher as a God botherer to, countless thousands of people before I'd even sort of quite put the steps together myself. So that became the Christian Inquiry, House of Beasts and Vines. And we don't have a mega audience. There's about 20,000 people a week read it, and they really read it. And that for me is fabulous. And I have a really warm sort of, it's not just small little comments, it's a whole involved process. There are friendships that have grown from it. I think, as you probably commented, one of the things I did from the beginning was an audio recording. And you quickly realize that what's written down and what I actually say are slightly warring influxes. They're not quite the same. So there's a slightly psychedelic edge. If you're actually reading it and listening at the same moment, you see my storytellerness going off piste and then coming back on. But it's just been something that has been journeying into this. Orthodoxy is about to become a field hospital for Western evangelicals, I suspect. I think that's what's about to happen.
Yeah.
And so it's partially, well, okay, here's someone on the ground having that experience. Here's somebody whose dad is a pastor, oh no, a preacher whose brother is a pastor. I'm well marinated in oratory and argument, but orthodoxy is about prayer and confession. So the evangelical questions that we will be bringing to the Orthodox community may well not be answered, may well not be answered because they're operating from I'd have to say, sort of an almost just a different part of the psyche. It is a very old thing. And so House and Beasts and Vines has been my move into that world. A lot of it I'm not new to, as I've just described, but there are other things about it that are quite startling. On the one hand, all storytellers are kind of the hinge between communities. And on the one hand, I'm talking to a lot of Christians about the the underpinning stories and the hydration of those stories that we've all grown up on. And at the same time, I have a deeply, uh, I was going to say an unconvinced, but between me and you, things are changing so fast. When I started, people were terribly disappointed with this move. And I heard from a young person the other day who said, he's just getting baptized. And he said, atheism is for old people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Atheism is for old people. It's not just me, you, Paul Kingsnorth, and Justin Brierley blowing on the embers. This is real. This is actually real. My own church. I can't. You know, when I first started going to this little Orthodox community, put it this way, there was a lot of space, visual space to express myself in that room. I can barely get through the door now, and it is just like the YouTubers are saying, it's young guys who are 17, 18 years old, possibly on the spectrum,
Yeah.
and they are just magnetized by this, and they're not foaming at the mouth right wing little fascists or whatever the smoke and mirrors is about this. They're just people seeking a deeper life.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening. And so I suppose this is a long answer, but this is what House of Beasts and Vines has been about.
Yeah. It's, I was reading and listening to a bunch of things. And now the nice thing about talking to you about this stuff is, as you said, because of your backstory, you know multiple worlds in this. And when I went to college, about my junior year in college, I started going to a Christian Reformed church that was, at that point, it was small. It blew up a little while after I started going, not anything to do with me. I was just a college student who was attending. And it was a fairly charismatic Reformed church that um, there had been a charismatic in the 70s. The 70s was a time of all this experimentation. And we get a denomination like the Christian Reformed Church that's sort of set off to the side. It has its own weather and things. Well, then you had a group of people that were sort of playing with intentional community, and they were playing with some of the stuff that was going on in the charismatic movement in the 70s as well. And that community, as so often happened with many of those communities, they had more ambition than wisdom, and they had more enthusiasm than ballast. And that sort of caused a rupture. And so this little Christian Reformed church I was going to was sort of a mixture of some of the racial reconciliation stuff that had happened in the 70s, and that had a lot of refugees from the sort of intentional community, charismatic element. And so that church was kind of a field hospital for these people. They needed something a little less ambitious, a little slower, something they didn't have to work quite as hard to maintain as sort of jumping into the deep end of the pond. And the longer I was there, sort of me as kind of a college student who had grown up more on the racial reconciliation side, more on the 70s. My father's church was sort of an experimental place where Christian Reformed youth who weren't quite ready to hitchhike their way to the West Coast and go to the Summer of Love, but they were feeling some of the vibes. And so this little black church where the rules were a little looser and they had a little bit more elbow room to explore. That was my father's church, but it wasn't terribly charismatic. And so then when I added the charismatic element, I began to have a sense that it wasn't really a theological shift. It was a shift that had everything to do with sort of a counter enlightenment, counter modernity shift to it. But um, you know, just sort of a biblicism that reacts to a secularism, also sort of bottoms out at a point. And what I sort of notice, the sense I get from reading The House of Beasts and Vines, is that you're working with people who they're pretty convicted that they've found the Enlightenment church that they've been offered um, too shallow, too dry, but they want something that's got some definitely has some rootedness to it. And there's a very interesting, as I've been talking to people that are very much on that journey that you just described, there's a very interesting resonance between the Orthodox and the charismatic of the 70s in terms of, okay, we know that that the canvas of the world is larger than this folded, trimmed canvas we were given. But we don't quite, we were looking for guides to help us navigate the strange, and it's not going to be terribly rules based. I'd say it that way. And so, and your story is different because, of course, you were one of the more fearless ones who did light out for the territory. And, sort of, and you weren't satisfied with a sort of a half measure. But then, of course, you've come back. And what's interesting to me about what you're doing now is I very much get the sense that you're operating, I don't know to what degree you're doing this intentionally or not, but you're operating as an evangelist, but it's not the Billy Graham crusade, that's for sure. So, and you very much, one of the things you're very much doing, which I know Nathan Jacobs was interested in doing, I don't think he's quite had all of the alignments that he's been looking for. But it strikes me that you want to make the Bible sufficiently strange again for people because until the Bible, you're not going to read it fairly until it's sufficiently strange to provoke something in us. I wonder maybe you could clarify how you
Mm.
see your vocation with this, especially given, again, the roots that you have.
Yeah, I'll refer to my younger and wiser brother Tom, who's a pastor and my dear friend. And he said two things to me recently, actually. He said, one, you're doing a good job of as an interpreter. He said, because your language is unusual and fresh, there's just a different framing of very, very old ideas that you're not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But suddenly the meal, it's like, oh, there's smoked paprika in this meal. I'm not sure that was there before. So I appreciate the notion of interpretation. And it's funny, I hadn't registered that note of being an evangelist. But of course, as a Christian, you're proud to do that. That's it's wide up there. And but secondly, I think of myself as such a sort of degenerate and a rascal. I'm sort of surprised whenever that word is constellated. But it has my whole heart behind it, and I'm not hiding, that's for sure. Yeah. Now, on to the notion of the Bible. Now, me and me at the moment, we're Tweedledum and Tweedledee, me and Kingsnorth, forever entwined. I'm to that poor man's misery, I'm sure, but we are forever entwined and we are good friends. But one of the things Paul and I have talked a lot about in the last few years, it's kind of a natural place for us, would be investigating saint stories. Saint stories are wonderful. Paul has a book on the wild saints that'll come out, I think, in a couple of years. I've been doing that stuff myself for some time. But I have to tell you, what you quickly realize is that um, there are structures and conceits within those stories that just replicate from country to country to country. There are patterns, very much like a folk or a fairy tale. So you really have to choose a saint story very carefully. You want one with a zip code. You want a reference to a locality and some personality in there. Otherwise, it's a facsimile. It's just Egypt photocopying itself into Connemara. But The Bible does not roll like that. This has been my surprise is going back to the Bible. The stories are tremendously strange. The one thing I've learned in the last 3 years is this: just don't get God's attention. If you can possibly help it, stay on the lowdown, because what God calls a blessing is for most of us, those
Yeah.
blessings very rarely play themselves out. Oh, lucky Jacob.
Yeah.
Really? Is he
Yeah.
really the lucky brother? So interestingly, although I tell a lot of saint stories, there's a tremendous amount of meat on the bone back in the day because everybody is so complex and befuddled and malevolent and then holy and then back to ignorance. It's an extraordinary, it's a very unusual, to use the phrase, it's a very unusual mythology because often if you don't have the narrator saying God bless this person and God wants this to happen, you wouldn't necessarily see them as particularly heroic. So the Bible is paying dividends, but between me and you, it unadorned, it's stranger than we could ever cope with.
Yeah. Yeah.
But to come in with the particular listening ear that I would have and a particularly idiosyncratic skill set that I now have to move into somebody as complicated as Samson or the story of Ruth and Naomi or the raven that bring the meat to Elijah or Jonah. I mean, good Lord, this stuff is fantastic. But I just did not receive the nutrient of it from the pulpit somehow when I was a
Yeah.
kid. I don't know how.
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of the dilemma. I mean, the church has in many ways turned wine to water. And I think that's something that our Lord will judge the church for. Um, because the longer, I've been at this preaching business for decades now, which is a rather shocking things to say, but it's true. And the more I, you come to these passages and you come to these stories and they are strange. And part of the difficulty of what happens in church communities is that the strangeness is unwelcome. The people's, to a certain degree, many people who shuffle into church, they want a quick answer. They want a solution. They want a remedy. And as you just said, I think is so right. When God decides he's going to use someone, he does really use them. And this is something that we really wrestle with, partly because if you look at someone like, let's say, Paul of Tarsus, who he was having a lovely career. He was having a lovely career being a zealot. He had the admiration of the important people around him. And if let's say you had been one of Paul's friends, and after the road from Damascus, of course, he sort of disappears from something like 14 to 17 years, and we know nothing of that except he was in Arabia and he's in some other places. What he was doing, we have no idea. And he sort of gets, he reemerges when Barnabas recruits him to help this crazy thing happening in Antioch. And his life is just a mess. And, this is something that I always, one of my pastors at that little church in Grand Rapids, he was a drug dealer in New York City. He was Puerto Rican. He was known as Spanish Danny, and he had actually met my father, and he had a little bit of he was angry with my father, which is a very unusual thing. Nobody got angry with my father. My father wasn't just a person I'd get angry with, but whenever he would evangelize someone, he would always immediately try to talk them out of it because he said, I don't want you getting into this with the wrong impression because of what it is. And when I watch I certainly celebrate with my Orthodox brothers and sisters the 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 excitement and the enthusiasm and the blessing that it is to be a season of fruitfulness. But as you said, the patterns are there's a flowering, and then there's the seed bearing.
Yeah.
And the reason seeds are surrounded by such sweet, delicious fruit in nature is that they're to be eaten by beasts and disseminated out into the world. That's
Yeah. It's so fascinating for me. I meet everybody I seem to meet at the moment is talking about orthodoxy, but the moment they do it, they sort of go starry-eyed and start referring to the desert and getting a small holding and living in Wisconsin or Vermont or, getting out.
yeah,
And they very rarely talk about living in a small Greek Orthodox parish
yeah,
or a small Russian. Do that first.
yeah,
Do that.
yeah,
Uh, the desert means walking away from your addictive nature. That's what that means. It means getting a grip on the things that are riding their passions through your life. And it may be possibly easier to get some space around you in a more remote location, but the glamour you see, and glamour mythologically is a glamour is a spell. To put a glamour on somebody is to enspell someone. And you've heard me rant on this before, so forgive me. But I have 30 years, 3 decades of experience of taking people way out into the bush and leaving them in forests and mountain regions for 4 days and 4 nights. I trained in this work for 8 years. And I tell you, those places are there are as many crazy people there as there are saints. And there are Navy SEALs amongst us spiritually who are designed to do that kind of work. But a lot of the material younger friends of mine at church are reading at the moment is high steroided stuff for super monks. And most of them are not going to live that kind of life. In the end, they're going to fall in love with Tracy, and they're going to want to have kids. And then they're not everyone is, Seraphin Rose is the new Che Guevara.
yeah, yeah,
That's what he is. He's pretty and gay and had to deal with all that. And I think probably, I can't imagine how many people I'm infuriating at this moment. Do it all in one go. I admire the guy. I have a picture of him on the wall. But I would imagine probably having to do that with his sexuality
yeah,
probably is so hardcore to
yeah,
just cut that at the root.
yeah,
Everything is going to have that tone from
yeah,
that point on. But most of us are not going to be Seraphim Roses. We're not going to be doing that. And you're going to get very disillusioned if you don't, look at what he points towards, not just him. And what he's pointing towards mercifully is God. So go there. Sail your ship, as Paul says, fall into the mind of Christ. But these very charismatic characters, because I have a backstory, there won't be many people you interview who lived alone in a tent for 4 years without. I did all of that already. And to a degree, I'm walking back from that and meeting countless thousands coming the other way. And to some degree, I'd say proceed with caution.
yeah. I Early on, I listened to Richard Rowland talk about hagiography, and of course, hagiography, I think we have to come to terms with it because, on one hand, it'll always be with us. It has its role, it has its place. But when you look at the life of, maybe non-famous saints, the saints among us, people who there won't be a strange or extraordinary enough to get famous, but they are the kinds of saints that Christian communities rely upon and are built upon. The as I think you're pointing to, it's so much of it is just hard. And I worry when, okay, so this person gave up their gay lifestyle. Okay. And this person gave up their gay relationship. Okay. Um, I look at more someone like Henry Nouwen, who, after he was dead, other things came out about him. The Dutch Roman Catholic, who people loved his writing in the 70s, but I would think in almost every case, you don't glory the story of the cross is that glory always comes out of suffering, and suffering is always so much easier in the rearview mirror. It just is. And for these
Yeah.
young people starting their journey, even though we celebrate the heroism and we celebrate the victory, I don't know that anybody who's lived through the trenches can just sort of do it easily or flippantly.
No, you will be aware that recently I've started to write on Substack about something called the Merry.
Yes.
And even in the name, you can feel that's my response to the sort of the gaunt, emaciated, terribly narrow road of the Desert Inquiry. The merry is a word, actually, if you go back to the notion of merry England, Robin Hood and his merry men, it's not meant to be merry like artificially cheery. But the thing about my particular situation is that I live in a family with, I would say, nonconformist parents, really, an evangelical brother, a Catholic sister. So it is really, really important to me that I talk over the fence to my brothers and sisters in Christ. They are my family. You know, I am not a fan, if you can possibly avoid it, of sectarian Christianity. I know all about it. So what I've been thinking about over the last 3 years is, well, what's going on in the evangelical world? What's going on in the Catholic world? What's going on in the world of, the Plymouth Brethren? What's going on in the Church of England? And I do notice that there is a kind of collective longing for a deeper appreciation of story, some kind of more involved relationship with God's original church, the ecology around us. Many of us do warm towards the notion of liturgy that we haven't had before. And finally, for me, it's an odd phrase. I call it initiatory Christianity. The notion that if you really attend to what the Christian journey is about, it is going to take you through all the deep stages of human evolution that all the great myths and talk about. But this is the moment where, to use the old cornball expression, the myth becomes fact. And the response to that, whether you are, orthodox or anything else, has been voracious. So there's something going on there that I'm really interested in. At the same time, being a very content and deeply moved and overwhelmed member of the Orthodox Church, but I'm not a naive one. I'm not a naive one. So I've seen some of this rodeo before,
Yeah.
and that's where you find me.
Maybe maybe we should talk about the fences because I get the sense that part of what's happening in our increasingly interconnected world is that the topography of the different tribes is breaking down.
Yeah,
And that isn't to diminish. Different tribes have different glories and different strengths, and we need all those because it's a crazy world we're living in. This internet has, I mean, we wouldn't have, I think, this flourishing of orthodoxy if not for the fact that something of orthodoxy has been able to be communicated by the internet.
yeah,
But I have a sobriety about anything that is communicated by the internet is in some ways falsified by that process. There is no escaping that. And and so when I look at what the Roman Catholics are going through, and I look at what my own little denomination goes through, there is a commonality now between us that the internet has put upon us, and all of us are going to have to deal with it because we can't. Well, you can leave the internet alone, but there are costs to that. And, both of us are using the internet. I mean, when you showed me your YouTube channel, which I think is a tremendous YouTube channel. On the other hand, these screens have a way of, it sort of reminds me in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when the animals of Narnia just note that the those who have eaten the witch's food, you can sort of smell it on them. And I wonder to what degree, when we get to when we get when we shuffle off this mortal coil, we'll get they'll still have some of the smell of the internet on us.
Years ago, I met. I won't name the tribal groups because that would probably irritate them, but I met a tribal medicine man who was part of a wider group of native folk who I had a friend in who he would have known, and I mentioned the guy's name, and we were having a public conversation, and he shifted his whole body so he wouldn't look at me anymore because this man had been named.
Yeah.
And afterwards, I said, "What was that about?" And he said, "That guy's family were fort Indians, fort, Fort.
Yeah.
In other words, when they were being starved, they came in to eat the white
Yeah.
man's food."
Yeah.
And, I had another friend that brought the last two native speakers of a particular indigenous language together, and the two of them smiled at each other and turned their backs. And the
Yeah.
guy said, "You don't want one final conversation?" They said, "We never got on." And such is the indigenous way. They're prepared to let that die
Yeah.
rather than have that conversation. I don't quite know what that has to do with where we are, but I needed to say it for some reason. I wonder when did this happen in America, the Orthodox thing? Is this like the last half decade? Is it the influence of Jordan and Jonathan and that kind of thing? I don't know.
That's been the most recent wave. Molly Worthen, she just recently became a Christian, but she was a secular academic who wrote a really fine history of neo-evangelicalism in America. And if you read that book, you'll discover that Orthodoxy had come over in earlier waves too, and you would often find a few Orthodox in academia, but for the most part, most of the Orthodox were came over through these immigrant groups, the Greeks, the Russians, and of course those groups came in depending on what was happening with geopolitics and the waves it would come in with. But part of this is also one of the things that I look at with interest is the difference of, let's say, cradle Orthodox who come in from the old world. They're on a very different narrative journey than, you can't call them neo-Orthodox because that word's been taken by a whole different group of people. But the new Orthodox. So I met at ARC. I met Father Matthew Brown from Manhattan, and really enjoyed him. He told me that when someone becomes a catechumen, he tells them they can't watch YouTube Orthodoxy for a year, which I think
Yeah,
is very
yeah, yeah, yeah,
wise.
yeah. When I was a catechumen, I wasn't allowed to read any books. No
Really?
book, no books. No, they
Yeah.
said no books. They said just copy, just copy. and
Wow.
you just had to learn how to become orthodox in your body. I was waiting for some sort of great, endless theological disclosures and, a sea
Yeah.
of Bible study. And they said, no, just copy. They said, so come in, kiss an icon, light a candle, do this very slow. The liturgy is a very, very slow ancient dance form, believe it or not. And you were entering a dance, and the dance has a shape, the dance has etiquette, the dance has a certain style, and you are moving entirely into experience. You're not moving into a narrative on the experience, you're having the experience. And they will just keep soaking you in that, often without a great deal of comment, for at least a year. And so books, church history, which is something that a lot of men in particular just kind of fall into, they're very wary with that. And what they're really interested in, eh, to see what's happening at the moment, to see on YouTube sort of confrontational young Orthodox guys, that is not Orthodox behavior. That is not. It's not like that. We usually will be waiting. A catechumen has to announce themselves to us several times over. They effectively sit at the door of the church, and you go, well, what can you do for us? Not the other way around. And that's why so many young men are turning up. What can you do for us? Because they've waited their whole life to be asked that.
Yeah.
And they go, let me show you how beautiful I am.
Yeah.
Let me show you how diligent I will be. And it is a thing of beauty. These guys, they're glimpsing something. Something is about to happen. I'm not quite sure what is about to happen, but whatever the petri dish is that we've all been in for the last few decades is changing.
Yeah.
And one of the things I notice that people like, uh, I would say that orthodoxy is effectively it's profoundly introverted. It's profoundly introverted.
Hmm.
And because we live, I would say, in a very extroverted culture, a confessional culture, there is something about the deep interiorness of orthodoxy that I think people just find inexplicably attractive.
Hmm.
And that's what we're dealing with in our little church.
Yeah. I noticed on your Substack that you're going to do a tour in Ireland.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
a big one.
Big one. Yeah, 6 nights a week for 3 weeks, and it's with really the King of Ireland, who is an American comedian, not an American comedian, an Irish comedian called Tommy Tiernan. Now, Tommy leads the great chat show at prime time Saturday night on Irish television. Everybody in the country watches it. Everybody knows who Tommy Tiernan is, and Tommy. The thing is that Tommy doesn't know who the guests will be. So he sits there and Tommy, it's Bono. Tommy, it's, Billy from the shop. And he has no idea, and he has to navigate through usually a difficult or a wonderful experience. He's very,
Yeah.
very brave like that. But Tommy has a love of folklore and storytelling. We've been friends for about 5 years, and we are both going to go on the road together telling stories. Some of them will be saint stories, some of them will be folk tales, culminating in Dublin. We've got people coming all from all over the world for this. Absolutely. People are just blocking out September and October. Uh, you know that Ireland is a remarkable place. I must admit, I kind of think they need a break after Catholicism. I think, again, really forgive me, Lord, but I think they need to just sit by waterfalls and play harps for a couple of decades.
Hmm.
I just they just need a break from being told what to do. So how that'll work with orthodoxy, I have no idea. Orthodoxy is very strange because on the one hand, it's extremely formal, but on the other hand, it's quite anarchic, which is
Hmm.
lovely.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, it seems to have lots of rules. We spend 160 days a year fasting. That's what you're going to get. I am, in English terms, I would be about 50 pounds lighter than when I joined the Orthodox Church, you know. So you're going to be fasting, you're going to be chanting, you're going to be in church services where, unless there's a reason, you're going to be standing up for hours at a time. You're going to enter very unknown territory within your own psyche, and there's not a lot of handrails. There's not a lot of handrails. So all of those things are thrilling, but whether or not in 5 years there will be a fallout, I think, from a lot of it deconstructs it just beautifully through beauty and mystery. It's going to either deconstruct a lot of what you think your religious questions are, or it'll be unbearable and you'll have to leave and go somewhere else.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, how do you see your vocation right now? I mean, you're doing the Substack.
Yeah.
Someone is facilitating your YouTube channel for you, which I think is lovely. And you're going to do this tour, and you've had a lot of interesting. I mean, your vocational journey has been interesting. Nobody lives in a tent for 4 years, and um, that's not a common vocation currently.
No, no, it's not. Well, in a way, you might be able to help me by mirroring back to me what you see, you know, because in a way, I'm doing what I've always done, which is I'm an artist led by imagination.
Yes,
And
yes.
that's what has never I've never done a thing for cash ever, you know, just not a thing. Weirdly, I have luck like that, so I find myself relatively solvent, but not through any ambition in that way whatsoever. I just wanted to, in the words of the old mythologist Joe Campbell, I wanted to follow my bliss, and I did follow my bliss, and it's leading somewhere really interesting. But what would be the difference? What would you say would be the difference between me and Paul Kingsnorth?
Oh, you and Paul just temperamentally are very different. Paul, I mean, what's so interesting with Paul is he's got this prophetic streak to him. You know, when he does this first things talk, it's just been so much fun to watch because you know, again, we're just coming out of, we just had Easter and I did Stephen yesterday. Yeah, there's a reason they kill prophets. And Paul is, but we're in a weird age that we're in a weird age when we sort of embraced certain kinds of prophets and made them cool and popular. And what that meant was we sort of forgot what real prophets were like, how annoying they are, why they get killed, because they're just they're just not gonna let you in peace. They just can't do it. Um, you have a prophetic element about you, but part of the struggle of the time, I think, for storytellers and artists is that, I mean, people don't people don't think about the fact that when music was first put to page, that was an innovation. And
Mm.
then people could read music and replicate the music sort of. And now, of course, with YouTube and with streaming television, we are awash in stories. We are inundated, but again, this word story is something we can't just leave sit anymore because what you are doing, it requires something of your audience, whereas so much of what we are doing now on these screens asks nothing, and in many cases, the more you pay, the more it's worth, and we're paying nothing. And so none of it's worth anything. And so when I look at, I loved, I got to know Heather a little bit at the art conference.
Mm. Yeah,
And
yeah.
she and I just were able to sit down and have a conversation together for a couple of hours. And she could really tell me her story. And that was lovely. What I see happening is that, again, I think this is very analogous to what we've been talking about with respect to people gaining interest in orthodoxy and people gaining interest in the desert. There's a degree of naivete and folly around all of this. And I think what you are doing is giving people a peek into the fact that um, we're sort of playing with things we don't understand. And when we find rumors of outliers who have been burned, we probably need more stories from those locations because as a culture, we're all sort of getting singed and cloyed by what we've created. I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, yeah. I was just curious because obviously I get something I notice in my life is when I go into situations as someone that's written 17 books and won awards, immediately there's no problem. Immediately you're taken seriously. But you bring in a word as problematic as storyteller, as an oral storyteller like I am, and you're dealing still with an outlaw vocation. It's still more like a preacher in the market square. It's still
Hmm.
strange. It's still slightly outside the city gates. And it's interesting. I look back. I mean, I have no one to blame for this but myself. I began in a tent. I began in a tent. That's still a peak experience in my. I still live there in a way, but I notice it. I notice that, like in the story of Enkidu and Gilgamesh, I smell of the wild. I smell different. I'm
Yeah.
different. I'm
Yeah.
different. I'm
Yeah.
different. And on occasion, that is terribly painful
Yeah.
because you feel very blocked when you're just repeatedly saying things that I think are of cultural value
Yeah.
that just do not get the leverage. You know,
Yeah.
One thing I'd like to say though about Paul, having known Paul for a long time, is that what he does have is courage. He had courage long before he became a Christian. He has always sort of sniffed the air, thought about the thing that's not being said, and said the thing that's not being said.
Yeah.
And that has had him in some extremely tight spots.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing, that's how you earn your name in
Yeah.
the end. That's how
Yeah.
you earn your name. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. But I think part of what you and Paul have in common is that I don't know that in this world either of you will find rest for your souls. I don't think so.
No, no. But we found, for some reason, we were here at the same time.
Yeah.
Isn't
Yeah.
that interesting? And we
Yeah.
became, I neither of us could have coerced the other one into this encounter. It was
No.
entirely God given. And
Yeah.
for some reason, he wants us bumping into each other on the
Yeah.
road every now and then. But
Yeah.
these, as we said earlier on about these biblical stories, we're all in them. There are, wheels within wheels within wheels we can't possibly understand. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when you do a tour like this, tell me what you see.
Ironically for me, say I'm just about to go to Canada. The audience I longed for on my first book has now arrived.
Hmm.
So, to my great frustration, I'll go out and do a night for 700 people that are really, really into what I hit upon in 2009. And you have to find a way into that keeps it fresh for yourself, uh, whilst knowing that, you know. that may not be the absolute burning end of your thinking at this particular moment.
Hmm.
And so I've made lots of, personal sacrifices. So the last year, I've been leading a course called The Skin Boat and the Star. To take your point about a slight sense of the sulfur about the internet, in real time, I led a 7 month course with 60 people from all over the world looking at, the mythologies and the stories that underpin the Bible. The last weekend was me, Kingsnorth, and Rowan Williams, ex-Archbishop of Canterbury, where I come from. That's top table, Rowan. That's a top table experience. And I wanted to do that in real time. But to do that, I had to draw a line in the sand and say, you know what, for now, the stories that you generally come to me for, I am simply not going to get you because I have to go on this adventure.
Hmm.
And this adventure is a different type of meal. Christianity, Christian stories, saint stories, they're a different palette. I have less acid reflux, I've been saying recently. There's less indigestion, but the meal isn't necessarily as remarkable as the one when you're used to having 3 shots of vodka at the end and a cigar and a bit of cheesecake and you're off to the bordello. That's a different, it's a different meal. It's a meal I remember with tremendous affection, but I'm not having that meal now. So I think that's what I'm going to find. I'm going to find 700 guys wearing hats like this and scarves like this. And there's a little Marty in each town, there really is. And then, ironically, in a few years' time, there'll be a million House of Beasts and Vines.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
mean that. I don't mean that hubristically. It's just the
Yeah.
way nature works.
Yeah.
If you really are ahead of the curve,
Yeah.
then ironically, you don't always get the rewards at the time. It's
Yeah.
something that comes with time. But my spiritual rewards, my soul rewards are overflowing,
Yeah.
So I find myself in a community like you do of many of whom are watching right now, beautiful, opinionated, troublesome travelers on the way. I love it.
Well,
Thank you.
that is exactly my audience.
Yeah.
Um, it also strikes me that, and I talked to you a little bit about this when we were together too. It's in this world right now, it's fairly safe to be a storyteller of anything but the Bible.
Yeah.
And it's been very interesting in the 1950s, Hollywood found the Bible again, and you had Ben-Hur and The Robe and all of
We
those
did.
kinds of things. And Hollywood is finding the Bible again now, and you have The Chosen and the House of
Do.
David. But I watch these things and I think, hmm, um, we're doing it again. We're continuing to turn wine into water, and we have to water it down because, I mean, nobody in Hollywood has the guts to really play. And I don't mean the way that, I mean, they've done it to the Bard endlessly in good and horrible ways, but the if the Bible is going to sort of land with people, I just don't know that culturally we can do that yet.
Yeah. Do you know, whenever I'm in Los Angeles, which I haven't been for a few years, but the audience is entirely screenwriters.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
just rows and rows. And I will be, I mean, I won't showboat to give you the names, but the most extraordinary and extraordinarily well-known folks have come through, and they look and they sniff and they go, yeah, yeah, we could turn this into a Broadway play, we could turn this into a musical, we could turn this into a movie. Um, and that sometimes happens, but it's a deadening process. I find it's a deadening process. I do put a lot of price on a bit of personal liberty and freedom. I do like that. I like in Irish myth, there's a great hero called Fionn McCool, And Fionn is asked, they say, what do you love most in the world? They say, do you love, is it the belling of a stag? Is it the sigh of a contented woman? Is it the crack of lightning? And Fionn looks into the mid distance and he says, the thing I love most is the music of what happens. And I love the music of what happens because I am a Celt. Paul is a Saxon.
Power just went out.